Hi everyone and welcome back to the series. In the last episode I finished test fitting, and in this one I'm going to cover sanding, filling and scribing. I consider this step to be the most important step of all, as it has probably the biggest impact on how your kid's going to look at the end. And yes, I would even say that is more important than how well you paint, because I always find imperfections really noticeable to me, so it really jumps out if I see those in a finished build. So you know all these really amazing photos that resin manufacturers put out of their kits, they always look super clean, super smooth and everything. But you need to know that it doesn't come like that out of the box. Them being perfectly smooth is the result of hours and hours of sanding and filling. Usually a resin kit is littered with lots of scratches and misalignments, and I don't think a lot of people realize this, or they're just lazy about it, as I quite often see people, who will do the initial removing tabs and sanding the tabs, but then they'll just go straight to priming and painting afterwards. And I think even more people assume that when you buy a resin kit, the kit will automatically look awesome in the end. But it is the effort that you put in that makes the difference. Someone I really admire is this Chinese modeler with a very Western name called Augustine Wayne. He's such a perfectionist and so dedicated to making his kit spotless that he'll make sure he'll sand everything smooth, and if he sees a tiny piece of dust on the paint, he will sand it and paint again. And for tiny details in places that he can't sand, he will just remove the details and make his own. And yes, it is a very tedious process, but it's down to the time and effort that you're willing to put in, and the end results really shows. And it is this level of perfection that I've really aspired to. So the first step to cleaning up your resin kit, you'll need to prime the parts. I recommend getting lacquer ones instead of water-based acrylics, as I've found acrylics to be quite difficult to sand sometimes. A great tip is to add some black into the primer, because some primers can be quite light in color, so giving it some black will increase its covering power, and in turn you can use less primer. It is okay to just lightly prime it, as most of the surfaces will be sanded down anyway. What primer does at this stage is to reveal all the imperfections on the resin, which otherwise is quite hard to identify on unpainted resin. You typically find this sort of unevenness around the edges of resin, and all you need to do is just to sand it flat. For this I will use 400 grit sandpaper, but if you have thicker pieces to sand, it might be worth it to use 320 or 240 grits. Once you have cleaned up the unevenness, you can go up in grits, so it will be 600, 800 and then 1000. For curved edges you can use a sanding sponge. A sanding sponge will conform to the shape of the area, instead of just sanding flat. To judge how much you're sanding is to see if the primer in the area is gone. If you see primer in the middle like this, it means that the surface is not flat and it's preventing the sandpaper to sand that particular spot. So once you're able to sand that primer off, you know that the area is level now. For tighter spots like this, you can use a sanding stick. You don't necessarily need to buy it, you can just make your own out of popsicle sticks or thin pieces of metal, for example. I don't know if you can see the scratches after I've sanded the area a few times. Again, if I see them, it means that the area is not flat, so here I have to sand it until I don't see any primer. Sometimes you encounter places that are too small for even a sanding stick to go in, and in this case you can cut off a very small piece of sandpaper, fold it and then hold it with a pair of tweezers, and you can sand tiny areas like this. Another commonly seen imperfection is holes or air bubbles, and to fix these you can use different kinds of liquids. You can use liquid putty. It's really great at filling small gaps, but not so much for bigger gaps because it's not very viscous and it tends to shrink when it's dried. For slightly bigger gaps I like to use super glue. I like using it because it's super easy to get and it dries really quickly. But they're not so great at filling smaller holes because they are more viscous than liquid putty. For very tiny holes like this, you might find that even liquid putty is too thick to get in there and fill it. In this case, you have to do something that's counterintuitive, and that is to create a bigger hole by drilling, and then filling it back up afterwards. On a side note, there's also something called epoxy putty, but it's mainly used for sculpting and filling really big gaps, and not so much for fixing imperfections. Sometimes you'll find panel lines quite shallow. It might be like that out of the box or as a result of sanding. If the lines are only shallowed, then you can just use a scriber with a matching size, and then just rescribe and deepen the lines. But if the lines are gone, or you want to make some new ones, then you have to apply a scribing tape. After you've done all these steps, you can go and reprime again, and you should see that the surfaces are smoother now. But if you still see some scratches, or you've missed some spots, then you have to go back and redo all the steps again. So once you've done all of this, and your surfaces are super smooth, then you're finally ready to paint. But I'll save that for the next part. Again, if you have any questions, then ask me down below. I hope you have found this useful, and I'll see you in the next one.